Hey guys, welcome to a new movie review. I apologize that this is another late kind of review. The film I'm going to review for you today, I think came out the same weekend as Venom 2, so I want to say October 1st or so is when this film came out. And that is the prequel film, The Many Saints of Newark. This is a prequel story to the Sopranos TV show that was on HBO back in the day. Takes place several years before that show even happens. We focus on a young Tony Soprano here who was once played by James Gandolfini in the show, and Michael Gandolfini, who's his son, takes over for his dad in the role since obviously James Gandolfini has long passed away in real life. And it kind of makes sense for the story being told here since it is about a younger Tony Soprano. Thus, a younger actor is kind of required for such a role like this. But overall, guys, in the Many Saints of Newark, what the story is mostly about is Tony Soprano is a young man. He's kind of a troubled young man in high school. He's trying to join the football team. He's kind of getting in trouble a lot. But he has this uncle that he's kind of always looking up to. And this uncle necessarily isn't a good person. He's a part of the mob. He's getting people killed. He's um, hurting friends and family. There's even a small subplot in this movie regarding him kind of hurting this friend of his just to get with this girl that he really likes, and obviously how that kind of hurts him later on in the long run with the series of events that happens to him regarding all that. Um, there's all these things with this uncle that he looks up to for whatever reason. I think he's jealous of the fact that his uncle has a lot of power. He can kind of get whatever he wants. He always has an excuse for why he's stealing stuff and getting the stuff that he wants and things like that. So for whatever reason, Tony Soprano is just kind of obsessed with the guy. And so over the course of the movie, him and his friends are kind of getting into trouble. They're not necessarily getting involved with the mob necessarily, but they're getting in trouble. They're doing things that they probably shouldn't be doing. They probably should be focusing on schoolwork, and Tony should be probably focusing on getting onto the football team and having good grades and all that kind of stuff. But over the course of the film, we find out what exactly happened to Tony Soprano that made him into the man that he was over the course of the Sopranos show. How much of that uncle figure in his life kind of inspired him to be the Tony Soprano that we later knew him to be in the show, and how growing up in kind of this rough neighborhood where the mob was very present and there was a lot of political and racial issues going on at the time, and how Tony kind of grew up with that and kind of how that formed him to be the person the way that he was when the Sopranos show begins. So overall, guys, one thing I do want to kind of disclose here before we even go further too is I've never necessarily been a huge fan of the Sopranos show. I've seen quite a few episodes of season one, but I never saw like season two on out. So anything that this film tries to nod or reference in those later seasons, I probably was going to go way over my head while watching this. But that kind of goes into kind of my positives and negatives of this movie. I thought the film was overall pretty okay. It's one of those things where I think if you really, really love The Sopranos, if you'd really just kind of love to see the idea of younger actors and younger actresses playing these characters that later become significant in the Sopranos show, and obviously they're way older by the time the Sopranos show even starts. And if you're intrigued by that idea, if you're willing to kind of catch all the little references and all that kind of stuff that made the Sopranos the way that they were, I think you'll have a more fun time with this. And if you don't know anything about the Sopranos at all, I kind of know like the bare bone basics of the show and things like that. So there was a couple things in this movie that I was able to kind of catch on to. They're like, oh, okay, that's kind of what the show did, and kind of a nod to that one thing from the show and things like that. So, but overall, from my positives and negatives of the Many Saints of Newark, why it kind of works and doesn't work as a movie is I think overall this is a nice looking production. It definitely looks like a lived in place. They definitely did a good job making sure that the mob kind of felt like it was this overbearing force where if you messed with them, you could get killed at any second. That if you got on their turf or on their face in the wrong way, you were not going to live for like the next week or two, obviously. But it's a nice looking production. Like you can definitely tell they use places that are very much in the spirit of that Sopranos TV show as far as where that show took place and everything like that. It's a nice looking production. I think whoever they hired for a production designer for this film did a pretty good job for the most part. Michael Gandolfini playing a pretty much a near perfect young Tony Soprano here. He definitely plays the role in the spirit of his dad. There is kind of a part of me that wonders how much um, personal feelings he had while going into this movie. If maybe this was something that maybe somebody talked to him about, if this is something that was kind of a personal choice for him, or whether it was just a little bit of both of those things. Whatever the reason was, I think Michael Gandolfini definitely honored his father's legacy by playing a younger version of him, and definitely playing a character that I can definitely believe could be Tony Soprano later in life and things like that. So Michael Gandolfini's performance was really great here. They definitely marketed it a lot for those who are happy and excited about that part of the movie. I think that part of the movie pays off as far as his performance goes. The film also does a good job showing how Tony's uncle got the power that he did. You really get the impression that if he doesn't like somebody, if you get on his bad side, if he wants to steal something, if he wants your girl, if he wants you dead, if he wants your car, you definitely get the sense that he has the power and the friends and the family to kind of get what he wants done right when he wants it done. He's gone a lot. They definitely play into that with him and this love interest that he has, and how she kind of goes off on her own path and makes bad decisions too, and things like that. But you definitely get the impression that this uncle that he had a lot of power, can definitely inspired him in many ways to become the Tony Soprano that he did. And I thought that aspect of the story was handled very well. And for the most part, I think this movie does continue that vibe that The Sopranos show had, that I think a lot of people really enjoyed. It definitely feels like it belongs in the same universe. It definitely feels like if they were to make a sequel to this, I don't know if they will. If they were to make a sequel to this, I definitely feel like this is kind of the right universe to establish to make it feel like Sopranos again and things like that. I think one part I did miss from the few episodes I have seen of Sopranos, that was kind of more intriguing to me than just the gangster stuff, was Tony actually going to therapy and admitting stuff, and you get his honest opinion on things, and how the therapist kind of takes it in and things like that. That aspect of this, I thought that was one aspect of The Sopranos I thought could have made its way into the movie somehow. Obviously, it's years later when Tony seeks out therapy, but that is one thing of the show I wish could have somehow made into the movie, because I think in the show it worked out pretty well back when that was on the air for HBO and things like that. But for my negatives of this movie, for the most part, one thing that I think the film was really trying to do that it just didn't really succeed at by the time the end credits started to roll is I really had a hard time believing that this is how Tony Soprano came to be, because my biggest issue with this movie is, yes, he's inspired by the uncle. He kind of wants to be him, sort of. But a lot of the things the uncle does that are really terrible and awful are things that Tony really isn't even around for to witness. So it's one of those things where, like, imagine watching Joker. Joker's clearly in the movie, but a lot of the terrible crime-related things that happen in it don't involve the Joker at all. And that's kind of what this film felt like. And while the Joker actually made it about the Joker and did a character study, and it was him doing all the bad stuff and things like that, I think that's one thing that maybe Saints of Newark could have benefited from, is getting inspired from Joker to be like, hey, we could make this about Tony doing all these terrible things as a young man, and that's kind of how he becomes the person that he does later in life. It's just one of those things where, as far as persuading me to feel that way, that this is the guy that does become Tony Soprano, obviously Michael Gandolfini's performance is really good in this. As far as this is what the character will go once the show starts, I don't think this film succeeds in that very well. It's just a guy that happens to be in the same universe as this terrible person, and he wasn't necessarily there to witness that terrible person do those terrible things. And for the most part, too, you can definitely tell this film was inspired by, like, Goodfellas and Godfather, but not in necessarily the best ways, because there's a lot of generic gangster characters and tropes in here that are just kind of typical gangster genre stuff. You have the people with the accents, you have them smoking cigars and cigarettes and taking their girlfriends out to fancy restaurants, and all the stuff that you've seen a billion times in the gangster genre, specifically in the Godfather movies and Goodfellas. This time around, Sopranos found a way to make that kind of interesting again, I guess. But this time around, it just felt kind of generic. It was just kind of going through the motions, really, this time around. I wasn't too impressed with how they were handling the side characters and the gangster tropes, and not really bringing any kind of new life to that at all, unfortunately. And like I mentioned earlier, this isn't the most persuasive film at all. I really was not too persuaded that this is the Tony Soprano that came to be, even though Michael Gandolfini's performance is fine. And obviously, there's things in it that could inspire a Tony Soprano hypothetically. Um, Not the most persuasive film I've ever seen. So, um, also another thing too is with for it being the whole Michael Gandolfini being a young Tony Soprano thing. For those who are looking forward to that the most with this movie, you don't even get that until about an hour into the movie. The first hour is just kind of stuff that the uncle is doing, a really, really young Tony Soprano in those scenes, and they're not even played by Michael Gandolfini in those scenes. Um, just a lot of stuff that kind of sets up the story and maybe sets up the Sopranos universe a little bit. But um, as far as Michael Gandolfini's performance goes and what they could have done for a potential character study, they don't even do that until about an hour into the movie, unfortunately. So, unfortunately, if you're most excited for that part, you got to wait for about a good solid hour of this movie to get into that. And it's a 2 hour movie, just to let you know. So, only about an hour is spent with Michael Gandolfini. Um, I also thought, like I said, that this film really would have benefited from being a character study. I think this really would have helped the Tony Soprano character out a lot because the film doesn't seem too interested in exploring his psyche very much. I don't know if that is just a choice because in the Sopranos show they kind of explore that. Um, as just a casual moviegoer taking this movie in, I just think this film would have benefited from a more character study kind of approach. Not so much. I mean, you can make the uncle a significant character and everything, but um, I really think this film would have just benefited from a bunch of terrible things happening to Tony Soprano as a kid that just made him the guy that he was. I think that was something that this film would have benefited from is just do more of that and less so giving this kid an uncle that's bad. This uncle is kind of what he's sort of like later in life, but he's not there with the uncle when a lot of the terrible stuff is happening. So it's just one of those things where I think this film would have easily benefited right off the bat just from being more of a character study, more so than placing a young Tony Soprano in a universe that later becomes the Sopranos TV show. But overall, I'm going to give this movie a 7.5 out of 10. I think it's okay. I think if you're a casual moviegoer like I am and you know maybe a little bit about The Sopranos, you'll probably pick up a couple things with this. Michael Gandolfini does, like I said, do a very good performance here as a young Tony Soprano. Um, it does continue the successful vibe that the show had, but unfortunately, I'm not too persuaded that this is the Tony Soprano that came to be by the time that the movie's done with. There's just a lot of generic gangster characters and tropes in this. We don't even see Michael Gandolfini playing a young Tony Soprano until about an hour into the movie, and I just would have preferred more of a character study approach here than just the way that they chose to do it. So 7.5 out of 10 for me. It's okay. If you're a hardcore Sopranos fan, I think it's worth checking out. If you really don't know anything about The Sopranos, if you're trying to learn about The Sopranos over a course of 2 hours of this movie, I don't think this movie will be quite for you. I would say rent this one, and definitely rent this one if you're a Sopranos fan. If you're not, though, you could either just skip this one or rent this one probably. So 7.5 out of 10 for me.